Here we are on the riparian corridor of Coyote Creek, just upstream from up the bank from the creek. And we're looking at the riparian vegetation. We've got usually three levels of vegetation in a riparian area: the understory, the mid-level shrubs, and the trees. And in many urban areas, the trees are really what remains of native vegetation. The riparian trees provide a really important function, many really important functions. One of them is that they shade the creek, so it remains full of oxygen longer, because a cooler creek is a more oxygenated creek. Just like when you boil spaghetti and the water bubbles out, heat increases the um, decreases the holding capacity of the water for oxygen. So it does that. It provides uh, the bottom of the food chain when the leaves fall into the water. So either the creek is making its own um, food through photosynthesis of algae when there is sun on the water. So we need some areas where there is sun on the water, but we also need the alloplankton, is the food from the outside. But some of them I'm curious about. I know there's been studies showing eucalyptus aren't as good of a leaf for the insects in the water. And I'm very curious about bay leaves, because they are generally, there's a large bay here, and there are some stretches like the Adobe Creek in Santa Clara County where there's a lot of bay right along the creek. And it's generally uh, it doesn't, insects do not favor bay tree because of the ketones and other strong chemicals that are in their leaves. In the distance, you can see a toyon. There's often coffee berries. That kind of mid-level shrub is really important as uh, a place to hide and a source of food for wildlife. Then the understory in a riparian ecosystem has a number of different plant species, and that's what's most damaged in urban areas. As you can see, I'm standing in a bed of Himalayan blackberry. Fortunately, this park has a lot of our California native blackberry remaining, and we can look at the differences. So here we have the Himalayan blackberry growing over the top of a little California native blackberry, trying to eke out survival here. One nice thing about the native blackberry is it tends to let other plants grow in amongst it, whereas the Himalayan is a bully and it takes over. You can see, as I was saying, that the thorns on the Himalayan are bigger and sparser. So there's just a few along the stems. The leaflets sometimes have 3, sometimes have 5. Whereas the California native blackberry, let's look at this a little closer. Sometimes it's hard to see it has 3, because both of them tend to have the leaflets merged. So that's really 3 leaflets, but they've grown together there. When they get to be a little older, farther down the stem, more often we'll see the 3 separate leaflets. But take a look at the spines on the California blackberry. They're much more comfortable to hold on to because they're tiny little spines, and they're much more numerous and dense along the stems. You can see them down here at the base. There's just lots of little fine spines. So much more comfortable to handle than the gnarly Himalayan blackberry. So it'd be lovely someday if somebody could help rescue some of the populations here in this park. They both have edible fruit. Unfortunately, these tend to be much smaller and need more sun, I think, to get the fruit into production. So that's one reason some people feel protective of the Himalayan, because they're good eating. But they are, as I said, a bully plant of the riparian understory. So we mentioned willow as one of our native vegetations. It's a really versatile plant for using in restoration because it is very easy to root. You can cut a willow branch and stick it in the ground, and if there's enough moisture, it puts out roots. It's got a rooting hormone. So grassroots ecology, where I work, we have a nursery, and we take willow stakes and soak them in water, and the rooting hormone comes into the water. We can use that to help other plants get started. It also, apparently, when it moves with the water, it actually can reduce friction like the little holes on a golf ball do. So water moves through faster than without it in some cases. So some of the roughness along a creek bank can slow down the water, but apparently some of it aids in water motion. So that's pretty cool. So we have a couple of grasses in the understory. Sadly, both of these are non-native grasses, and a lot of people would be surprised to hear that this one is a grass, since it's towering about 15 feet over my head here. This is a Rundogonax, the giant reed plant, and it is the plant that is used for musical instrument reeds. But it is very invasive, and unfortunately along a creek bank it can get spread because chunks of it will break off and travel downstream and reroot the little root nodules or stolons that are moving along the ground. So we have successfully removed this from some creek banks by sawing and then covering it with tarps, or in some rare cases stump applying some herbicide. But our preference is to cover it over with tarps until it gets shaded out, and then come back and remove any regrowth that happens. So it's a tough one to work on, but it's good to get early. Like this patch would be a pretty quick job. We have also sections of the Central Valley that have acres of it, which is unfortunate. I wish we could just turn them all into musical instrument reeds or use it for biofuel or something like that. Hopefully somebody will figure out that kind of a use. This one is Smilograpss, and it reminds me a little of bamboo too, just the way it grows with very obvious nodes and branches of leaves. It's another perennial grass that's non-native. So the perennial non-natives are it's very important to get the roots out. You can't just cut the tops and expect the seed bank to go away. So you got to dig these ones up. But fortunately, they don't have a really deep root system. So they're just taking up a lot of space that our native plants would use to feed wildlife. You see very little insect damage on our non-native plants like this. And we want to see insect damage because we want to see insects, since they're an important link between the vegetation and the wildlife that lives here and eats them, like birds and frogs and snakes and fish. So go insects. All right, here we are next to riparian understory vegetation of the mid-level, which is poison oak. It's a fabulous habitat plant. Won't get too close because I'm very allergic to it. But it's a good thing to learn to identify it in the wintertime when the leaves are gone, and leaves of 3 let it be is no longer helpful. But the branches tend to have this parabolic shape that you can see to them. They tend to have these little thumb-like projections off of them, they're little branchlets. And that's one of the key characteristics. If there's a broken off branch, you can see black sap coming out. And that was actually used, and maybe still is, by some local indigenous people as tattoo ink. So you don't want to do that if you're allergic to this plant, obviously. But it's a very key characteristic is the black sap that comes out of the stems.
Okay, so this is a coastline oak. It's actually our most common oak in the Bay Area, probably. It's evergreen, so it's not deciduous like some of the other oaks. And it's incredible because it supports tons of different insects, which are food for lizards and birds and other animals, and it just creates a beautiful habitat. And I want to show you a few things that we could find on this coastline oak. So for example, I'm really interested in galls. Galls are little structures that are induced, usually by an insect, and they create basically a little shelter for that insect to reproduce. So in this case, a little wasp will lay its eggs on the leaf or the stem or a different part of the tree, and its larva will start chewing on the leaf, for example, and that will induce the creation of a gall, of a little structure where the larva will finish their entire development. And there are many different kinds, so many different species of wasps create different shapes of galls. For example, you can see this little flyer here that has many different species. There are many more. There are books that were written about galls on different host plants in California, and I highly recommend them. So this is California Bay. It's a wonderful tree because it smells so nice, and you can see that it's preparing to bloom. So it will bloom soon, I think, and then we'll have its bay nuts much later during the year. But the leaves smells fantastic. And often if you step into a forest that has many bay trees in it, you'll smell the trees. You don't even need to touch the tree for that. I love these trees. Mint, probably a non-native species. We often see them by the creek. There are a few different species you might see, but the smell is incredible. So the flowers, when they bloom, are highly attractive to pollinators. They're probably growing seeds now. Yeah, too bad you can't smell it.
One day we'll have smell-o-vision.
Yeah, maybe for the next virtual event. So many of the plants you see here are non-native, but we also have some native species. Often by the creek you'd find all sorts of non-native plants, but also some great native plants. So on the other side you could see maybe toyon, which is one of our native bushes with many red berries on top, and birds love eating these berries. Okay, so I'm standing here next to some beautiful Buckeye trees. Buckeye trees are deciduous, so they dropped all their leaves. They actually do it very early, but they also sprout new leaves very early. You could actually see the buds are already here, getting ready to go. And the other thing you can see here are the Buckeye nuts, the big seeds that already dropped to the ground. They were covered with skin or something, and then they dropped to the ground. I think they're so beautiful. Also very toxic, so they're kind of poisonous to eat. Even though the Native Americans used to cook them for a long time, for over 24 hours or so, and then you can actually eat them. But before you cook them, you could use them as for something else. So they would actually put them in the creek to stun fish, so they could collect the fish and eat them. So this is the Buckeye. Most animals won't eat it, but rodents probably eat that. Okay, so we're standing here on the other side of Coyote Creek that runs down there in an old walnut orchard. And you could see all these beautiful walnuts are now dropping their leaves, changing their colors. Probably drop all their leaves soon. So this is one, and another one. They are mixed with some of the native trees here that grow by the creek. But the cool thing about it is that these walnuts were grafted. So the European people that moved here, they grafted the European walnut that had the bigger seeds and tastier ones on top of the native walnut that was better adapted to our climate. And what you see here is a mixture, because after many years, sometimes the European tree died and you're left with just the native walnut, like in this case. So this is the native walnut. with its small leaves, okay, and dark bark like that. And you can see some of the lighter colored bark of the European walnut that used to be there, but it seems dead at this point.
So this gorgeous tree is the western sycamore, Platanus racemosa. And this is probably one of the trees that got me inspired to study ecology. I grew up in Los Angeles and had one nearby uh, natural area above, above Devil's Gate Dam near JPL in Pasadena that had beautiful sycamore trees right along the creek. And we are standing next to a gorgeous specimen. They provide lots of habitat. They have these gnarly openings and the big ones that can provide nesting spots for mammals. The bark is really platy, and because it doesn't expand, it's not soft like some trees that crack. It when the tree grows outward, it just has to exfoliate like granite in the Sierras does. So that's a very key characteristic. Now the western sycamore uh, is different from the London plane trees that we have along the streets a lot in Santa Clara County. And part of the difference is the seed pods that hang down. There's often several of the clumps, the little balls that hang off of the tree. The leaves tend to be not as loby. Sometimes they look like a dinosaur footprint to me with three big lobes, but sometimes they have more. And one problem we're seeing is that there's the London plane tree, which is a hybrid of the American occidentalis and the Asian, uh, which is orientalis. Um, that hybrid is used for street trees because they grow straighter. They don't provide the sprawling habitat, which I loved as a kid because it was easy to climb. They also tend to hang over creeks and then they fall in and provide good large woody debris, which we know we need for fish habitat and other purposes, functions of the stream corridor. Um, so they're starting to hybridize. So we're worried that that's going to change the genetics of our western sycamores and have changed the properties that they give the riparian ecosystem in California. So there's efforts to try and grow only the California or the western sycamore, Platanus racemosa. So there's our nursery has been helping with an effort to clone through cuttings, so we know we're getting pure DNA of western sycamore. So fortunately these days we can do genetic tests to look for um, how much of any of the hybrid might be in a particular plant. So we find the ones that are pure racemosa and clone them and plant them out in areas to make sure we choose different cuttings so that we're getting some genetic diversity that way.